The battle didn't end when the fighting stopped. Because what waited inside enemy camps was something far darker. Soldiers entered expecting rest, supplies, maybe prisoners. What they found instead stayed with them for life. Flickering fires, torn tents, whispered voices in the dark, signs of fear, signs of desperation, signs that something terrible had already happened. These camps weren't just places to sleep. They were where the truth of war was exposed, raw, unfiltered, and often hidden from history. What soldiers saw inside was never meant to be remembered. The moment soldiers stepped into an enemy camp, everything changed. The noise of battle faded behind them, replaced by an uneasy silence. Not peace, but something heavier. Something that made every step feel uncertain. Tents stood in uneven rows, some collapsed, others barely standing. Fires still burned low, sending thin trails of smoke into the air. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, dragged equipment, signs of sudden movement. It looked as if the camp had been abandoned in a hurry. Or worse. Every soldier knew this moment was dangerous. Enemy fighters could still be hiding, waiting in the shadows. A quiet camp didn't mean a safe one. It meant tension. It meant the unknown. Weapons were raised. Eyes scanned every corner. Even the smallest sound, a shifting cloth, a crack of wood, a distant whisper, could trigger panic. But it wasn't just the fear of attack. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. Personal belongings were scattered across the ground. Half-eaten food lay untouched. Blankets left behind. These weren't signs of an organized retreat. They were signs of chaos. Some soldiers began to realize they weren't just entering a camp. They were stepping into the aftermath of something they didn't fully understand. And the deeper they moved inside, the more unsettling it became. Because the camp wasn't empty. Not really. It still held stories. And not all of them were meant to be found. As soldiers moved deeper into the camp, the silence began to feel unnatural. It wasn't the calm after victory. It was the kind of silence that followed fear. Sudden, overwhelming fear that had driven people to abandon everything. Tents were left open, their flaps swaying gently in the wind. Inside, belongings lay scattered. Weapons half drawn. Armor pieces tossed aside. It looked as if the men who had lived here had no time to think, only time to run. Cooking fires had burned out unevenly. Some still smoldered, sending thin lines of smoke into the air. Pots were overturned. Food was left untouched. These were not the signs of a planned withdrawal. They were signs of panic. Soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Something had happened here, something fast, something unexpected. But what? The ground told part of the story. Footprints overlapped in every direction, deep and chaotic. Some led away from the camp. Others circled back, as if confusion had taken hold in the final moments. And then there were the sounds. Not loud, not obvious. Just enough to make every soldier tighten their grip on their weapon. A faint rustle from inside a tent. A distant movement behind stacked supplies. The kind of noise that made it impossible to relax. Because even in apparent abandonment, the danger wasn't gone. It was hidden. Some soldiers began to realize that the enemy might not have fully left. They might still be there, watching, waiting. And in that moment, the camp transformed from a place of victory into a trap. As the soldiers pushed further into the camp, the truth began to reveal itself, piece by piece. Inside the tents, the signs of disorder grew worse. Bedding overturned. Supplies scattered. Personal items left behind without care. It was clear now, this wasn't just panic. It was something more intense. Something that had forced people to abandon everything they owned in a matter of moments. Some tents held evidence of hurried preparation. Bags partially packed, weapons gathered but never taken. Others looked as though they had been searched, turned inside out as if someone had been looking for something. Or someone. The air felt heavier the deeper they moved. The smell of smoke, sweat, and damp earth lingered. It clung to everything. Every surface told a story, but none of it was clear. Then came the smaller details. A cup still warm. A cloak dropped mid-step. Marks in the ground where something had been dragged. These weren't just objects. They were moments frozen in time, the last actions of people who had been here only hours before. Soldiers began to move more slowly now. Carefully. Because this no longer felt like a victory. It felt like walking into something unfinished. And the deeper they went, the more they felt it. That strange, creeping awareness. They weren't the first to move through this space after whatever had happened. Something, or someone, had already passed through. And whatever it was, it had left its mark on everything. What the soldiers were seeing wasn't just chaos. It was the reality of life inside these camps, something rarely recorded, and even more rarely understood.
Ennemis quand WRNT organisé sanctuary.
They were fragile, temporary spaces where fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty lived side by side. Soldiers slept lightly, always ready to wake at the slightest sound. Supplies were never guaranteed. Trust was limited. And every night carried the possibility of attack. As they explored further, the invading soldiers began to recognize familiar patterns. The layout of tents. The placement of weapons. The signs of routine life interrupted. Because despite being the enemy, these were soldiers just like them. They had eaten here, slept here, waited here, and feared here. The scattered belongings were no longer just evidence of panic. They were reminders of shared humanity. The same hunger, the same fatigue, the same constant awareness that survival was never certain. But there was also something darker beneath it all. These camps were places where discipline could break down, where stress built over time, where decisions made in moments of fear could change everything. Some soldiers began to understand that what they were seeing wasn't just the result of one event. It was the result of pressure, days, weeks, maybe months of tension finally collapsing all at once. And now, they were standing in the aftermath, not just of battle, but of everything that had led up to it. A hidden side of war that rarely made it into history, but one that every soldier, on both sides, knew all too well. When the soldiers finally left the enemy camp, they didn't leave it behind. Not completely. Because what they had seen there stayed with them. It wasn't just the abandoned tents or the scattered belongings. It was the feeling, the silence, the sense that something had happened so quickly, so intensely, that it left a permanent mark on everything it touched. For many, that memory lingered longer than the battle itself. The clash of weapons faded. The noise disappeared. But the image of that empty camp, frozen in a moment of fear, remained. Some soldiers couldn't stop thinking about the people who had been there. Where they went. What they felt in their final moments inside the camp. Whether they had escaped, or faced something worse. Because in that brief time, the enemy had stopped being just an enemy. They had become human. And that realization was difficult to carry. War was supposed to be simple. Us and them. Victory and defeat. But inside that camp, the lines blurred.